Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope coming you once again this week from Houston in Texas. There's a lot to discuss when it comes to U.S. politics, so we're going to get right into that. There were the riots at the U.S. Capitol building, people entering the building, pro-Trump supporters, of course. Donald Trump made a statement seemingly in support of them, then has come out and has essentially admitted that, that Joe Biden is essentially the president-elect of the country. We've then had the suspension initially of the certification of Joe Biden, then the certification of Joe Biden's win as president-elect. Trump's statement of a smooth transition of power is probably the latest development in this entire issue. Again, it comes from a confusing set of messages coming out of the White House initially, right, where it was about how the election was stolen, in indirect terms, possibly even perceived encouragement of these protesters to an extent, obviously not a call for outright violence. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Calvin Dark, who is the principal and co-founder of RC Communications. He's joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. Joining us from Hillsdale, New York, is Dr. Todd Gitlin, who is a professor of journalism and sociology. He is also the chair of the PhD program in communications at Columbia University. Todd and Calvin, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us here in Scope. Todd, I'd like to start with you. Let's start firstly with the riot. What are your thoughts about that? Why did this occur? I had a guest yesterday talk about how there isn't enough discussion about why this may have occurred, what the grievances of those who were carrying this act out are not being discussed enough. I mean, is that a fair thing to say?
Trump has been inciting this riot for years, day by day, through his propaganda networks, through his channels of deceit, of lie, of distortion. He has created a fantasy world in which he won the election, for which there is absolutely no evidence. And unfortunately, there's a considerable portion of the American public who think that this is a true story. That is, he was cheated, he was robbed, and that the government whose building they invaded on Wednesday is not a legitimate government, and therefore they had every right to take control of it, because in the end, they believe they are the legitimate Americans. They are white nationalists, largely Christian. They believe that Trump is their savior. They believe that he has come to deliver them. For many of them, there's a religious inflection. So this has been building up for years. And then in the immediate circumstance, he and his people and the Republican Party have been promoting coming to Washington in this fashion. They've been preparing for violent assault. It is well known via Facebook and other social media that these preparations were underway for reasons that we don't understand, and we will not understand until there is a thorough congressional investigation. The police authorities were not prepared. They weren't even close to prepared. So it should be no surprise that this happened. Trump has been courting violence from the very beginning at his rallies when he bragged during the 2016 campaign that he could shoot somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue and still not lose any votes. It turns out that he was right. He would lose a few votes, but his core, his base, are with him in an absolutist way. This is not the political party called the Republican Party is not a traditional American political party. It is a club. Yeah. It is a paramilitary unit. It is a white supremacist.
Points that you just made, Todd, if you allow me, and put those points to Calvin. Calvin, Todd got through quite a few points there, which I wanted to bring up with you as well. Specifically, if I may hone in on, the fact that Donald Trump really has very loyal supporters. And I mean, he's probably not the first politician in history to have such loyal supporters, but this is a very violent outpouring of support for the man, right? I mean, do you think that even possibly he was taken aback by this level of support that he would have? And what does that then say going forward? I mean, yes, he's come out and said, I'm going to, ensure a smooth transition of power. But is that enough? I mean, do you think that he's going to be able to walk this back?
No, I don't think it took him by surprise at all. And, I'll even go as far as to say he enjoyed seeing it. And here's why. One is seeing this unprecedented action unfold on TV, the reality star that we have in the White House. His ego was stroked because these were people risking their lives for him. And the reason why I don't think he was surprised is once it happened, they're reporting here that he didn't even bother to check and see where his vice president was, or the third in line, the Speaker of the House, and that he was basically MIA. As things were happening. And the second kind of proof that he really didn't condemn the violence is when he did, begrudgingly the day of, he put out that video, he said, "We love you." And it's exactly what he's done all his presidency, especially in Charlottesville. Good people on both sides. So I think that anything we saw yesterday, last night, for example, when he talks about, condemning the violence and that there'll be an orderly transition, it served two purposes. One is to kind of calm the people that are resigning as fast as they can type up their letters. But two, as a legal maneuver to lessen his exposure for inciting a riot. That he has now on record where he was condemning it, even though we could see he could barely read it off the teleprompter. And Donald Trump doesn't have trouble expressing his words when he believes something. So all of those efforts, I think, were hollow.
Okay, so Todd, let's talk about accountability and what ramifications there should be for all of this, right? Because I'm sure you've heard of this, and I would love to know your opinion on this, that yes, Biden has been certified now as president-elect. Yes, Donald Trump has made the statement about smooth transition of power, but nevertheless, there is still talk about enacting the 25th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, essentially kicking Trump out of office even during this little period of time left between now and the transition or the takeover of Joe Biden, should that be occurring.
You see, Donald Trump is a crazy man. He does not recognize a boundary between himself and the world. The world is good if it's good for him. That's all he can recognize. He feels for no one else. This is a diseased man, by which I do not mean to take him off the hook. He is also an evil man. He is indifferent to people's suffering. And he does, as Calvin was just saying, he loves the show. He loves being at center stage. He was never happier than as a TV star. He's never been a good businessman. He was a failed businessman. But as a TV star, and then as the president of the biggest TV show in the world, he presented himself as a sort of avatar, an incandescent, condensation of the desires, of the passions, the resentments of his people. He views himself and is viewed by many of them as a martyr in their cause, that he is they and they are him. This all sounds like madness. It is, but it's also evil.
Calvin, I wonder, do you think that the law should get involved here? Do you think the judicial process needs to hold Donald Trump to account, be it through the 25th Amendment? Does he need to be kicked out of office ASAP?
Yes, he does need to. But one of the things that I'm sure everybody on both sides of those issues here in D.C. realize that the way our system is set up, it would be a push, even if there was a lot of support, to even do that in the 12 days that are left. And, before Wednesday, I would have not even seriously considered that, not because he didn't deserve it for our past actions, but just because we have a new president that's going to be sworn in on the 20th, and we need to look forward. But what he did the other day crossed a line. And so I do think he needs to be held accountable, even if it's a statement or a declaration or censure or whatever. But in the practical sense, I don't think it could get done before the 20th, even if there was the will in Congress to do it.
Todd, the rest of the world, as you can imagine, is looking from the outside in at the U.S. And and are perplexed, if we're completely honest, right? So do you think, and how do you think, let me put it this way, that this entire tenure of Donald Trump and, this entire what's happened just over the past number of days, how has this affected American democracy, if at all?
I think the world is aghast. They see the worst side of America. They see the most racist, the most stupid, the most irrational, the most plutocratic, the most unbridled, the least democratic feature of America. This is not the totality of America, but this is, as an American, I have to say, not only a series of crimes and sins, but it's also a scandal. It's also an embarrassment.
And Calvin, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, because when we're going forward now, the discussion continues to be about, hey, we didn't know that within American democracy we would see one day where there would be this outpouring of violence.
Yes, it's shocking to us and definitely shocking to people around the world. I will say that I do think our democracy is strong. And one of the things that I did enjoy seeing is, although part of what Senator Hawley did, with the protestation of the vote is what caused a lot of the mob in the first place. It felt really good to see them go back into the chamber to finish congressional business. But I think the larger message that's being sent to the world and around here in the United States is we have seen in 2020 really racial tensions exposed in this country to an extent that, there was solidarity and support during the George Floyd protests and Black Lives Matter protests. And what we got to see yesterday showed the world that we have systemic problems of race. And I'll give you just 2 points if people are wondering, well, why is this a racial issue? One is, if you look at the people who are storming in, they've got their American flags and Trump flags, but they've also got Confederate flags and flags of white supremacist groups. Secondly, during the Black Lives Matter protests, you couldn't approach the steps of the Capitol. Yet, in our system and some of our law enforcement, unfortunately, when they see white male protesters, they not only got in, sat in the personal office of the Speaker of the House. So that just shows you that part of what's being exposed is our systemic racism that exists everywhere.
All right, so we'll leave it there at that, Calvin, but we sincerely appreciate both Calvin and Todd for their time this morning and for sharing their expertise with us on the latest regarding U.S. politics. And as Todd there said, the world is aghast as what's happened when it comes to the riot at the Capitol building. We have seen, in fact, I should say, many things over the past tenure of Donald Trump, which we were not expecting and have never expected really from the U.S. democracy, but it has happened. But what does this mean going forward right now? Joe Biden will be taking over in about 12 days now. Can that happen soon enough? I would think is in the minds of many, many Americans. But for others, this is a nightmare, right? Those who are Donald Trump supporters, that's why they came out on Capitol Hill. And that's why they are so angry as to then attack their own democratic institutions, which are so celebrated around the world and within the country. What does this divide mean? Will Biden be able to bridge this divide? What will Donald Trump do now that he has called for a smooth transition of power? Open-ended questions, which we'll have to see how they work out in the coming days. I'll leave it there now. I'll be back with my next segment. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi, coming to you once again from Houston, Texas. The Iraqi government has filed a lawsuit against the United States in a Swedish court, this over the U.S.-led coalition's use of depleted uranium munitions during the war, ever since, of course, the fall of Saddam Hussein in that country. Now, the lawsuit has demanded compensation, in fact, for the use of those shells, bombs, and missiles, which did contain depleted uranium. The UN has estimated that the U.S. used at least 2,320 tons of depleted uranium in Iraq. Now, on a separate issue, and I know these two issues are not directly connected, but they are maybe possibly in some indirect fashions, an Iraqi judge has also now issued an arrest warrant for Donald Trump, this not over depleted uranium munitions, but over the assassination of General Soleimani, as well as Mehdi al-Mohandes, that is, in Iraq. Those both, of course, assassinated on Iraqi territory by the U.S. And that, of course, led to, as we know, many tensions between Iran and the U.S., again, with the venue being Iraq. Let's discuss those issues a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Hamourtziadou, who is a senior lecturer at Birmingham City University. She also works for the NGO Iraq Body Count. She's joining us today from Stoke-on-Trent. Joining us from Doha is Zeidon Alkinani, who is a researcher on Iraq and the Middle East. He's also a PhD candidate at the University of Aberdeen. Zeidon and Lily, thank you both for your time today. Lily, let me start with you. What do you make of the lawsuit? Depleted uranium munitions, I mean, this has been spoken about and had been spoken about, of course, at the height of the Iraq war. Accountability in that regard, I would think, would be very tough, but how important is it?
Well, we've known for many years that there really is no accountability when it comes to crimes committed in Iraq. So although the lawsuit, I believe, is correct, I am actually not optimistic about any chance of success. We know that certainly since 2003, many crimes have been committed in Iraq. Recently, we had the ICC report on British war crimes, for instance, which is very detailed. And through airstrikes, we also know that the coalition has killed at least 25,000 Iraqis. And again, no one has been held accountable for this. Therefore, I am not expecting any result from any lawsuit because there doesn't seem to be any justice.
Zeidon, what are your thoughts on the lawsuit? I mean, it's coming quite a few years, of course, later than the use of these munitions, but do you think that it holds ground?
Well, it's been almost 18 years since the U.S. led an international coalition to invade Iraq and toppled the authoritarian regime of its very former ally and later opponents of Hussein, and to allegedly democratize the country. 18 years almost have passed, and we still cannot find a single valid indication that the U.S. had any intention of establishing a stable and a prosperous democracy in Iraq. Today, the U.S. has 7 military bases in the provinces of Kirkuk, Erbil, Salahuddin, Baghdad, and Anbar. Therefore, it would be unusual to witness a superpower voluntarily giving up all of this influence and military presence in an oil-rich country that is considered a regional strategic center to risking to admit that its presence in Iraq is originally flawed and a violation of international law. However, it's also a strategic mistake to blindly ignore the crimes that committed in Iraq, and especially those crimes are continuously evident and effective until this day. Iraqi families, neighborhoods, soil, and the healthcare sector are all permanent victims of the U.S. illegal use of depleted uranium munitions. But the U.S. global power status cannot admit to the crimes it committed against ordinary civilians, will at least have to own up to the compensations these people would need for decades to probably slowly overcome or even just minimize its impacts in the future.
So, Lily, when we're talking about depleted uranium munitions, and I know you work with Iraq Body Count, what have you found and what has the NGO found vis-a-vis what kind of an effect this has had? I mean, of course, some of us have seen those very, very disturbing images of the effect on children, on fetuses, et cetera, as well. But beyond that, how much of an impact has this really had in real world terms?
Unfortunately, the research that I do through Iraq Body Count doesn't take those things into account. So what we look at is deaths. So how many people have died? We know from weapons that the West has used in Iraq, it has directly killed at least 25,000 civilians through airstrikes and air raids. The after effects of that, including the cancers and the birth defects, we don't actually monitor those. But I personally read up on it, and I know this is among the devastation that the West has caused in Iraq, including poverty and diseases and all sorts of things, and they're not just to do with loss of life, but they're to do with humiliation and degradation and a sense of total defeat that must live in the hearts of especially young people. This is all they know. Anyone born around 2000, this is their life, and it is a life of defeat and misery by those who promise them democracy and promised them freedom and prosperity. And all they've done is violate human rights and violate the sovereignty of the state, of the new state that they allegedly built.
You know, Zeidon, it was interesting. In your first answer, you mentioned how, you know, Saddam was once a U.S. ally, in fact, but it's also interesting, right, that as we all know, Saddam used chemical weapons against Iraqis during his tenure. It's disturbing, isn't it, that even what followed Saddam then, i.e. the U.S.-led coalition, also used weapons which have, you know, so drastically and so inhumanely affected Iraqis?
Of course, these depleted uranium munitions, it's not only a dangerous attack in the moment, it continues to pose a long-term threat to the lives of ordinary Iraqi citizens as it poisons Iraqi soil with cancers, strokes, and birth defects, as mentioned across all scholarly articles about this. Many doctors and scientists maintain that the recent emergence of diseases that were not previously seen in Iraq, such as new illnesses in the kidney, lungs, and liver, as well as total immune system collapse, are connected to the public exposure to war contaminants. Moreover, there has also been a dramatic jump in miscarriages and premature births among Iraqi women, particularly in areas where heavy U.S. military operations occurred, such as Fallujah, and there are many documentaries about that. However, that doesn't come as a surprise from the powers, U.S. and U.K. in this case. UN Secretary General stated that the use of force without council endorsement would not be in conformity with the Charter. And many legal experts now describe the U.S.-UK attack as an act of aggression violating international law. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Nabi Pillay, stated that the leaked U.S. documents on the war in Iraq point to serious breaches of international human rights law, such as executions of civilians and torture of detainees in accordance with international covenants on civil and political rights, and other obligations to which both the U.S. and Iraq as states are parties. Looking at it from a dynamic today, whether the U.S. would pay an attention to such things, at least under the very last days of the Trump administration, you have, despite the controversy surrounding the September 2007 Blackwater contractors and its killing of Iraqi civilians, the U.S. State Department earlier after that plans to renew a contract with the security firm, and it finally ended with Trump pardoning the criminals, which just reflects no interest from the U.S. in being responsible or allowing itself to be responsible in front of the world. And it seems to be very hard for them to even own up to the compensations that these people need. We've seen many similar violations against international human law. We've seen many violations against the lives of Iraqi citizens. It happened during the sieges of Fallujah in 2004, where the U.S. used chemical weapons such as white phosphorus and a naphtha derivative, and causing indiscriminate harm and unnecessary suffering in the civilian population. Although the use of these weapons is banned under several international treaties and the Geneva Conventions, no government or the United Nations has condemned such acts, and these crimes remain unpunished. 17 years after the sieges, the population of Fallujah continued to face innumerable hazards, living with daily attacks and factional violence and having no access to clean water or health care. The British troops raided the National Iraqi Intelligence Agency in Basra, claiming the act aimed to capture a death squad leader and that they found 30 prisoners with signs of torture. These are just things that reflect the U.S. and the UK not standing up to the mistakes they did in Iraq. Even hospitals were not able to escape the nightmare of the inhumane and illegal invasion. There are so many reports about the percentage of hospitals.
Also, if you allow me to bring Lydia into the conversation, back into the conversation. Lydia, obviously it's priority to always talk about civilians, the Iraqis themselves, certainly, and how they've been affected by what's happened ever since the U.S.-led coalition got involved, since the fall of Saddam Hussein, or even around that time, in fact. But then now we have this other arrest warrant. I mean, this other case altogether about now we have two states fighting each other on Iraqi soil. I'm talking specifically, of course, about the Iranians and the Americans. And with the assassination of Soleimani and Mehdi al-Muhandis, of course, an Iraqi himself. But all of that complicates the situation further then, right? Because we have this arrest warrant now issued for Donald Trump over those assassinations. What are your thoughts on that?
So, again, these are all things that the international community knows. What Zeidon was saying as well. We know that the USA and the UK have violated Iraqi sovereignty. I mean, who kills a general on someone else's soil? You know, this is a sovereign state, and yet they're able to conduct any airstrikes and assassinations they want. And of course, it is correct to have a warrant for Trump's arrest. But again, I don't think anything is going to happen because the international community is actually not interested. This is the sad truth. We have monitored and we have documented, and even the International Criminal Court has issued reports, and still no one is being held accountable. Trump is not going to be held accountable for this assassination either, because, as I said, the international community does not care. It seems Iraqis are not important enough or high up on the human chain that the international community will actually care about what is happening in Iraq to the Iraqis and anybody within their country, civilian or not.
Indeed. Zeidon, I'll give you the final word. If you can just keep it to under a minute and a half. On this point of this arrest warrant of Donald Trump, and I know there's a huge debate and argument certainly that can be made about Iranian involvement too, and I don't want to put that to complete aside, but just overall then, the precedent has been set, has it not, that Iraq, as Lily said, has no sovereignty of its own, so whichever state of all of the above can get involved, can do things on Iraqi soil and get away with it? I mean, is that fair to say at this point that that is what the reality is?
Well, unfortunately, it seems like they would get away with it. We don't want to be extremely pessimistic and push away any attempts and any initiatives, such as the one coming from our guest here and from the MP who's trying to put any of the criminals or any of the crimes responsible and trying to monitor anything similar that could happen in the future. However, we need to highlight how it's almost a lost case in order to reflect the irony behind having the beacon of democracy trying to promote its democracy in other parts of the world while violating international human rights law. It is also a chance for us to teach other countries around the world the mistakes that the U.S. can commit or purposely commit sometimes in order for it to promote its democracy. As much as one should praise any attempts calling for compensations and accountability, as mentioned, towards the crimes against humanity, we also have to show the world that it's extremely difficult to be optimistic towards lawsuits filed by, in this case, Iraqi MPs and lawmakers in 2021, just weeks after Trump pardoned the Blackwater forces, and with the consideration that a more significant call took place in May 2006 in a letter to the UN Security Council by a group of 27 NGOs from across the world, pointing out that the U.S.-led multinational force in Iraq has seriously violated international law, including bans on the use of tortures, illegal detentions, siege tactics against population centers, and indiscriminate and especially injurious weapons. And the MNF was responsible for failing to address patterns of corruption and mismanagement in Iraq's development fund and reconstruction programs, which was heavily influenced and managed and supervised by the U.S. They even failed to cite numerous official reports and legal texts. The letter urges council members to at least substantially reconsider and revise and terminate the MNF's mandate to bring it into conformity with international law. Final words would be, yes, we support any attempts to hold any criminals accountable, whether they're individual groups or states or armies. However, we have to reflect and point out that we live in a very unfair and unjust world, unfortunately.
Yep, well, there's a final word, but we appreciate both Zeidon and Lily for contextualizing in this conversation, both of them experts, of course, on Iraq. Lily joining us from the UK, and Zeidon was speaking to us from Qatar. This lawsuit, as Zeidon said, I mean, he's correct to say it, of course, we don't want to be overly pessimistic either. But as Lily also said, we very much know that with all these cases, be it the one for the Swedish court because of depleted uranium munition use by the United States, 2,320 tons of depleted uranium, in fact, were used in Iraq. That's according to the United Nations figures. It may very well be more than that on the ground. And then, this arrest warrant because of the assassination of Soleimani and Hamdas on Iraqi soil by the United States, which then got the Iranians involved. I mean, it's a complete jigsaw puzzle and mess in Iraq, unfortunately, with different actors, external actors, seemingly having more power than the Iraqi judicial sources and judicial process and authorities than other countries do. So hopefully, yes, according to as Zeidon said, these things are a good sign, at very least, that the Iraqis are trying to take their sovereignty back, are trying to grasp control of their own powers to be in the country. And of course, we'll keep a close eye on that here in Scope. I'll be back with my final segment after this. Back here, still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Italy. And we've discussed, quarantine ships in other contexts as well when it comes to how migrants are treated overall in Europe. We could talk about, detention camps, quote unquote, of course, but more migrant camps as they would be called. In the context of Italy, we know that there has in the past been, right-wing feelings and sentiments, especially we can talk about possibly the likes of Salvini, etc. But now Rome is under pressure over how it is treating migrants in the context of the pandemic. And the pandemic, as we know, has changed the context for many countries around the world about how they treat any asylum seekers that come in. Organizations, human rights organizations, 150 of them, in fact, have said that the measures that Italy is currently using vis-a-vis putting people on ships offshore to quarantine for 10 to 15 days, that is in fact an illegal practice. It's against the human rights of these people who do very much, even within the context of a pandemic, have the right to seek asylum, and no one can take away that right from anybody. Certainly, it would be understood that we need to have measures in place to ensure public safety and health. But that, of course, all we can discuss right now with our esteemed panelist who is joining us today from Rome. We're joined now by Dr. Silvia Scarpa, who is a lecturer and adjunct assistant professor of political science at John Cabot University. Silvia, thank you very much for taking your time out of your busy schedule to join us here in Scope. What are your thoughts about this quarantine system overall? I mean, I would think that the Italian government would argue, listen, this is a tough situation for us, politically, as well as just logistically, because we're trying to keep our public healthy and safe. And, we know Italy had a hard time with the pandemic overall. Anyhow, what is the government to do?
Thank you very much, Waqar, for the invitation to discuss about this issue. This is a thorny issue, as you say, because the situation in Italy is difficult. As you might be aware of, the government is currently under attack, and there is probably going to be a crisis for our government. So this is caused by Mr. Renzi of Italia Viva, of this party. So if you look at that, it's probably difficult that the issue of migrants who are asylum seekers who are currently held on these quarantine ships might be dealt with in these days. However, it is also true, on the other hand, as you correctly say, the situation is difficult for the people who are on board of these ships. The ships have been, in a way or another, created as a new measure in April of last year for the purpose of hosting these increasing numbers of migrants who were arriving on Italian shores. And there was also this pressure by far-right parties, as including Salvini's party, so with populists in a way or another, generating fears that irregular migrants and asylum seekers arriving on Italian shores might pose a threat, a health threat in terms of COVID-19. As you might be aware of, this issue in terms of health related problems it has not been proved. Probably it's true the opposite. There are actually at least 2 cases in which it was demonstrated that the fact that asylum seekers and migrants are held on ships, on these ships, might have caused an increase in terms of the spreading up of COVID-19 on the ships themselves. Because actually, ships are probably not the perfect place for hosting people in situation of a quarantine. So if you look at that, while on one hand we have this difficult situation generated by the emergency and COVID-19, on the other hand, we also have the necessity, which is well expressed by human rights organizations to guarantee, in the same way as it is for other individuals, so on the basis of the principle of non-discrimination, that the health and well-being of people who might be already in distress because of the fact that they traveled by sea and because of the fact that some of them might have endured during their trips inhuman conditions, might have suffered. Some of them are coming from detention camps in Libya, and we are all aware of the terrible conditions in which they are held and the fact that they might have suffered from torture or other inhuman treatment. So if you look at that, this is a very difficult situation, and I really hope that Minister Hamourtziadou, who is our Minister of Interior, will deal with it very soon. I am confident because she has shown in the last months a very different path from the previous minister, who was Minister Salvini from the Northern League party. So she has dealt already with.
If you do what Italy is doing, because we can talk about a European context or a wider European context, if we may for a moment. There is and has been ever since the migrant crisis, even way before, of course, the pandemic even began, an anti-migrant feeling, right? A narrative where, as you said, populist parties such as Salvini, and we can probably list a number of others across Europe as well, which have ridden on this wave of xenophobia, etc., and have won, seats and or even, higher office in some countries. Is that the same case, do you think, in Italy, or do you think that, as you mentioned with the Interior Minister, that the tide is changing? I mean, do you think Italians' sentiments might be cooling or becoming more open towards these migrants?
This is a very interesting question, Waqar. If you look at that, I think that the current Interior Minister, Mrs. Hamourtziadou, has been doing good work in these months. She has adopted a new decree, which was then passed as law recently, that tried actually to read up in a way and to eliminate the effects of the previous decree, which had been passed by Salvini and which was actually also against some principles of international law. So if you look at that, it seems that the direction, she has always stated also in various interviews, that the direction is to guarantee, obviously, the security of Italy, but also, on the other hand, she has stressed at various times that the dignity of people, of the migrants and of asylum seekers, with full respect of international law standards as well as of our constitution, that provides for a very broad right for asylum seekers to find refuge in Italy, is to be fully guaranteed. So in this respect, I think that actually she has been very much open to discussion also with NGOs in the area of migration and human rights recently, even if I see that probably the recent death of this young Tunisian boy called Abu on one of these ships docked in Palermo might have generated again, obviously, on the side of the NGOs, this attention on the issue and the fact that this temporary measure actually can't become a permanent one. The issue is that we have always a pressure from populist parties who tend actually to put the issue in a very simplistic way as an issue of security and as an issue of us versus them. And honestly, I think that this is the very wrong rhetoric in this case. It's not us versus others. It's actually the all of us together. And probably COVID-19 tells us this more than any other crisis that we have seen in the past. The boundaries that we have created with states since the Peace of Westphalia, with the creation of modern states, are actually falling apart in a situation in which this disease actually knows no borders. So either, and this has been also stated clearly by many leaders, so either we all fight together against COVID-19 or we have already lost our battle.
So Silvia, I wonder, and of course you're an expert in this, within just, real world terms, right? So we have, it's important, certainly, as you said, to note that we are all very interconnected in this world, and that the pandemic proves that. But still, I mean, I would think that in Italians' minds, or some Italians' minds, I should say, that there is still very much that concern, right, about whether the facts support their thoughts or not, that an asylum seeker or a migrant coming from outside may very well be carrying the virus. So is it logistically practical to host these people on mainland Italy, I'm saying, in quarantine safely? I mean, is all of that possible? I would think it is. And then why wasn't that done from day one itself?
Yes, thanks, Waqar, for this question. I see your point. If you look at that again, then the question should be broadened, because again, it's not that Italy has closed all the airports or the crossings and the borders on land, which means that people are traveling and are still moving legally. So the problem here is whether or not people are then all treated equally, or maybe whether there is a differential treatment for some, because this measure of the quarantine on board of ships is only imposed on individuals who are arriving at sea in an irregular way. And as you know, this might include also a certain number of asylum seekers, so people who have a legitimate claim to be protected under our constitution and also under international law. So the issue is, as you say, maybe at the very beginning, in April of last year, when this first issue, let's say, of COVID and the problems in terms of the reception centers, because obviously the capacity of reception centers is reduced once that you have to apply the provisions, for quarantine, for quarantining people. So if you look at that, the issue is whether or not we have had enough time for rethinking the situation, and not only for adopting a measure which is an emergency measure. So as it is for the state of emergency on this, I think that we have to be very clear. Italy has been, as many other countries, in a state of emergency for many months now. And the state of emergency is currently protracted up until the end of the month. This is a solution which is an emergency solution. The issue is, can the emergency then become the normal rule, or should we hope and do whatever it is possible to transform the emergency into a permanent solution which is humane, which is non-discriminatory for the people who are on board of these ships, and which is a way that allows then the individuals to get disembarked from the ships so that they can get access to all the rights, such as also including the right to ask asylum and to start the procedures for asylum. This is actually something which was also emphasized by the national guarantor for persons deprived of their liberty at the very beginning.
I apologize for cutting you off. And a very interesting conversation, but unfortunately, the clock has gotten the best of us. We will try to have you back on to continue this discussion and to learn more from you on this issue within the Italian context. That was Silvia Scarpa speaking to us there from the Italian capital, Rome, today, sharing your expertise, as I said, on this, the current system in place by the Italian authorities vis-a-vis keeping their public safe, of course. I mean, that's an honorable thing to do in this context of the pandemic from anybody who's coming from overseas seeking asylum. And again, that is also an international right, according to international law, for people to seek asylum. So the Italians can't reject them outright. But then at the same time, the Italians want to keep their public safe from the virus. Is quarantining them on ships together the best way to do that? That human rights organizations say is in fact an illegal practice. So of course the debate is similar to one that is occurring in Europe in different contexts, but is one that is important to be having openly, because we need to keep our humanity in place at the same time as ensuring public safety and health as well. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.